Lucille Ball heard something during a rehearsal break that made her stop in the middle of a sentence and turn her head. What she did in the next 3 minutes without saying a word to anyone became a story that nobody on the set knew about for 40 years. It was a Tuesday afternoon in November 1956, and Stage 9 at Desilu Studios in Los Angeles was deep into the second day of rehearsals for an episode of I Love Lucy that would air in 3 weeks. The rehearsal had been running since 9 o'clock that morning with a break for lunch and was scheduled to continue until 5 o'clock. By 2:30, they had been through the episode's major sequences twice and were working on the smaller connective moments, the entrances and exits, the physical business that fills the space between the jokes. The crew on Stage 9 included 22 people who had been working I Love Lucy since the show's first season. They functioned with the particular efficiency that comes from doing the same complex job with the same people for long enough that most communication happens without words. Joe Benetti was one of 3 cameramen. He was 46 years old, had been working in television since 1947, had worked on I Love Lucy since the pilot, and was by every estimation one of the steadiest operators in the building. He showed up on time. He knew his marks. He did not make mistakes that required additional takes. He was, in the specific language of working crews, a professional. At 2:35, the assistant director called a 15-minute break. The cast moved to the edge of the stage. The technical crew stayed at their positions, some making adjustments, and some standing in place with the particular stillness of people who have been working for 5 hours and are taking the break where they stand. Lucille Ball was standing near the craft services table with Vivian Vance, discussing a change to the third act. She was mid-sentence when she stopped, not abruptly, but in the way a person stops when something at the edge of their awareness has shifted and requires attention. Joe Benetti was standing beside camera 2, 30 feet away, talking on the wall phone. The conversation was brief, perhaps 2 minutes. Ball could not hear the words, but she could see Joe's face in profile, and she could see the way he was holding the phone, and she could see the moment when he put the receiver back and stood there for 3 seconds with his hand still on it. She watched him turn around. She watched him look at the camera without seeing it. She watched him take a breath that was deeper than the breaths around it. She excused herself from the conversation and walked across the stage to where Joe was standing. The quality of her walk was not hurried, but it was direct in the way that cuts through ambient noise and makes people notice without knowing why. Vivian Vance, who had known Ball for 6 years and had learned to read the particular set of her shoulders when something had shifted, watched her go and said nothing. Ball reached camera 2. Joe was adjusting something that didn't need adjusting. She stood beside him for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but that had weight to it. Then she said, "Everything okay, Joe?" Joe Benetti looked at her. He had worked with Lucille Ball for 5 years. He had watched her perform comedy that required split-second timing and physical precision that would injure most people who attempted it. He had watched her run a set with the particular combination of warmth and absolute control that made people want to do good work and afraid to do anything less. He had never had a personal conversation with her that lasted longer than 30 seconds. He considered the question for a moment. Then he said, "My daughter's in the hospital. They were supposed to do surgery this week, but they postponed it." Ball did not ask why they postponed it. She did not offer the kind of immediate reflexive sympathy that the information might have warranted. She looked at Joe with the complete attention she brought to most things and said, "Which hospital?" Joe told her. "Cedars of Lebanon, and the same hospital where Ball's own children had been born." Ball nodded once. "What's her name?" "Linda," Joe said. "She's 9. Ball stood beside camera 2 for another moment. Then she said, "What time do we finish today?" The assistant director, who was standing 15 feet away and had been listening without appearing to listen in the way that assistant directors learn to listen on working sets, said, "We're scheduled until 5, but we're ahead. We could wrap by 4:30 if we stay focused." "Then let's stay focused," Ball said. She walked back to her mark. The break ended. They worked for another 2 hours. The blocking was finalized by 4:25. The assistant director released the cast and crew at 4:30. Lucille Ball did not speak to Joe Benetti again that afternoon. She did not ask him any additional questions about his daughter or the hospital or the surgery that had been postponed. She walked off stage 9 at 4:32, got in her car, and drove home to the house in Beverly Hills where she lived with Desi and the children. She made 3 phone calls that evening. The first was to her business manager. The second was to the administrator's office at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. The third was to her attorney. The conversations were brief and specific. By 9 o'clock that evening, arrangements had been made that Joe Benetti knew nothing about and would not know about for 2 more days. On Thursday morning, Joe received a phone call at home from Cedars of Lebanon. The voice on the other end of the line was the hospital administrator he had spoken to the previous week when the surgery had been postponed due to what the administrator had called insurance complications. The administrator said that the complications had been resolved. Linda's surgery was scheduled for Friday morning at 7 o'clock. All costs would be covered. Joe asked how this was possible. The administrator said that an anonymous benefactor had contacted the hospital and made arrangements to cover the full cost of the procedure and the recovery period that would follow. Joe asked who the benefactor was. The administrator said that the donor had requested anonymity and that the hospital was obligated to honor that request. Joe hung up the phone. He stood in his kitchen for a long time. He knew who had made the call. He returned to work on Friday. Linda's surgery was scheduled for 7 o'clock that morning, and his wife was at the hospital with her, and there was nothing for Joe to do but wait and work and try not to think about what was happening 12 miles away in an operating room at Cedars of Lebanon. The episode they were filming that day did not require camera 2 for the first hour of shooting, which meant Joe had time to stand at his position and think about things he could not control. At 8:15, the assistant director called for camera 2. Joe moved to his mark and began working. At 10:30, during a lighting adjustment, the stage phone rang. The assistant director answered it, spoke briefly, and then walked across the stage to where Joe was standing. "That was your wife," he said. "The surgery went well. Linda's in recovery." Joe did not say anything for a moment. Then he nodded. The assistant director walked away. Joe stood beside camera 2 and looked at nothing in particular for approximately 10 seconds. Then he wiped his eyes and went back to work. Lucille Ball was on stage that morning. She was performing a scene that required her to climb into a window, lose her balance, and fall backwards onto a couch in a way that looked accidental and was in fact the result of extensive rehearsal and precise choreography. She did the scene 4 times, once for each camera angle, and then moved to the next setup. At no point during the morning did she speak to Joe Benetti. At no point did she acknowledge the phone call that had come in at 10:30 or the information it had contained. She worked through the episode's remaining sequences with the same focus and precision she brought to every working day, and when the assistant director called wrap at 5:15, she thanked the crew as she always did and walked off stage 9. Joe Benetti waited until the stage had cleared. Then he walked to the small office near the stage entrance, where Lucille Ball sometimes reviewed script notes between setups. She was not there. He waited for 20 minutes. She did not return. He went home. On Monday morning, he arrived at stage 9 at 8 o'clock for the technical rehearsal. Lucille Ball was already there, working through a piece of physical business with the director. Joe approached her during a break. He said, "Miss Ball, I need to thank you for—" She turned to look at him with an expression that was not unkind, but that was absolutely clear in its message. "I don't know what you're talking about, Joe," she said. "Now let's get back to work." Joe Benetti stood on stage 9 and understood that the conversation was finished. He went back to camera 2. He did not raise the subject again. Not that day, not that week, not in the remaining years he worked on I Love Lucy and its successor shows at Desilu Studios. Linda Benetti recovered from her surgery over the course of 6 weeks. The procedure was successful. She returned to school in January 1957. She grew up in Los Angeles, graduated from high school in 1965, attended UCLA, and became a teacher. She taught elementary school in the Los Angeles Unified School District for 38 years before retiring in 2005. Joe Benetti worked at Desilu Studios until 1968, when the studio was sold. He worked in television for another 12 years after that, retiring in 1980. He never told his daughter who had paid for her surgery. He never told most of his colleagues. He never told anyone who did not need to know. In 1989, 3 months after Lucille Ball died, Joe Benetti was interviewed for an oral history project documenting the early years of television production. The interviewer asked him about working on I Love Lucy. Joe talked about the technical innovations, the 4-camera setup, the live audience, the particular energy of those early years. At the end of the interview, the interviewer asked if there was anything else he wanted to add. Joe was quiet for a moment. Then he told the story. He told it in the plain, factual way he told most things, without drama, without embellishment. He started with the phone call on Tuesday afternoon and ended with the conversation on Monday morning when Lucille Ball had looked at him and said she didn't know what he was talking about. The interviewer asked why he was telling the story now. Joe said because the person it was about was gone, and because his daughter deserved to know, and because there were things about Lucille Ball that nobody knew because she had spent 40 years making sure nobody knew them. Linda Benetti heard the story for the first time in 1989, when her father played her the tape of the interview. She was 42 years old. She had been teaching for 15 years. And she had never known that her surgery in 1956 had been paid for by anyone other than her parents' insurance. She sat in her father's living room and listened to the tape twice. The second time, she cried. Not because of what had been done for her, though that was part of it, but because of what had not been done, the acknowledgement that had never been asked for, the gratitude that had never been allowed, the 40 years of silence that had been more generous than any amount of money. In 2010, Linda Benetti was interviewed by a film historian researching the production history of I Love Lucy. She told the story her father had told her. She told it carefully, with the details in the right order, ending where her father had ended it, with Lucille Ball saying she didn't know what Joe was talking about and telling him to get back to work. The historian asked what Linda thought about it now, 54 years after the surgery. Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think about the fact that she never wanted anyone to know. I think about the fact that she could have told my father at any point, could have accepted his thanks, could have let him feel like he owed her something. And she never did." She paused. "I think that says more about who she really was than anything she ever did on camera." Joe Benetti died in 1994. Linda Benetti still teaches. She tells the story once a year to her students on the first day of school. She tells them that the most important things people do are often the things nobody knows about. She tells them that kindness without acknowledgement is the purest kind of kindness there is. She tells them about a woman who heard a phone call she wasn't meant to hear and made 3 phone calls nobody knew about and spent 40 years making sure nobody ever found out. She tells them that this is what character looks like when nobody's watching. If this story reminded you that the truest measure of a person is what they do when there's no one there to see it and no credit to be claimed, subscribe, leave a comment, and hit that notification bell. More stories about who Lucille Ball really was, away from the cameras and the studio lights, are coming every single week.